the current pandemic and even beyond. At the same time, the need to enforce self-isolation and social distancing will mean that many meetings will no longer be held around the boardroom table as we typically would have, but now will be held virtually using all various forms of technology. Company secretaries, being the custodian of, being the organizers of these meetings, are entrusted with the role of preparing for digital meetings and an important and potentially challenging responsibility of capturing accurate and complete minutes of the meetings. Today, on the 7th edition of our webinar series, centered around the company secretary and the new normal, we intend to provide some valuable insights on how these meetings can be held digitally, even during and after the pandemic. The session will also provide tips on ensuring proper and accurate recording and documentation of minutes of these meetings. Today, Ms. Agbo is the head company secretarial unit, which oversees a diverse client portfolio ranging from public, private, and not-for-profit organizations, and even family-owned companies. Will be sharing some useful tips with us today in the course of the webinar. Without further ado, please let's note the ground rules, some ground rules for this session. We encourage participants to change the names of your device. So as opposed to having Nike's iPhone, we would appreciate that you change it to your full name. So my name is Nike. I would appreciate that you change to reflect your full name. We also urge participants to remember to mute your audio when the session is going to avoid and minimize interference as much as we can. We would also encourage participants to leave comments and contributions in the chat box. So if you have any comment and any contribution you want to make in the course of the webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box. At the end of the webinar, after the presentation is done, we would accommodate as many questions as we can using the Q&A box. So we encourage you to just type out your questions using the Q&A box. Before we go further, I'll just like to introduce our company and what we do to our participants. Some of the attendees today are familiar with some of our services, but some others are not. So, as this says, what do? We provide, some of the services we provide include bespoke training for directors, senior management, and all other key organs of the corporate governance framework. We provide director induction, board retreat and strategy sessions. We also carry out board evaluation and peer review in line with the various codes of corporate governance. We also assist companies to codify their board and committee charter. We also carry out business advisory and regulatory compliance, as well as business recovery, company setup, company secretarial, executive talent recruitment, and director selection. So if you are looking to appoint a new director, that's something we can do for you, as well as remuneration and benchmarking service. Our facilitator today, like I rightly said, is Agbo. I'll just quickly project sorry for that break in transmission. So I'll just quickly project the profile is already on the screen, and holds an MSc in Corporate Governance and Accountability from the University of Glasgow, Scotland, and is a graduate of Obafemi Awolowo University. She was called to the Nigerian bar in 2005 and is a member of both the Nigerian and the International Bar Associations, and has attended leadership trainings locally and internationally, and oversees a very diverse company secretarial portfolio in DCSL. And will be sharing with us today, convening and preparing for digital meetings, and also sharing tips on minutes writing.
Thank you very much, Nike, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar series, which we hope will be a very interesting conversation. I'm very excited that we have quite a number of experienced company secretaries. Hopefully, we'll try and make the session as interactive as possible, so that we can also gain some insights from the more experienced company secretaries on the webinar as to how they have managed what has now been thrust upon us as our new normal. So the focus of our webinar today, really essentially is on virtual meetings. If time permits, we'll speak on a few aspects of meeting, writing, and meetings generally that impact, that will have an impact or that will be affected by the new normal, which is, as I said, virtual meetings. So again, virtual meetings is something that is not new to quite a lot of us. It's something that if our boards have non-resident directors, it means we're very familiar with holding virtual meetings because most of those directors will typically join the meeting virtually. Also, for those of us who have a very interesting range of directors with age dynamics or with some kind of age demographics on our board, while we may have tried, we may not have been totally successful with getting them to come on board on holding virtual meetings. Unfortunately, we have now been, I think, forced to adopt this as our new normal with the pandemic. It would have been best if the practice of holding virtual meetings was not something that was thrust upon us. But again, with the pandemic, we cannot but move with the trend. So I know that quite a lot of us on the platform today have held virtual meetings. We would like to just draw our attention and try to get ourselves on board as to what are the things that we need to pay attention to? And as a company secretary, what are those particular things from a legal perspective that we need to do to ensure that our meetings are not void? Without saying too much on that, I'd like to quickly ask what the temperature, get a sense of what the temperature is in terms of whether or not the new normal is something that is a welcome development or not. So to do that, we ourselves, everyone who is on the platform will be a member of the jury of this court, this honorable court this evening. So we would like to deploy a poll to test and get feedback as to whether the virtual meetings and the new norm that it is that has been thrust upon us is something that we are happy with or not. So the poll will take about less than a minute and it's been deployed. So I'll ask you all to please take a few seconds to vote so that we can then discuss how well we have taken on board our new normal. So voting is on. I hope that everyone can see it and we can all vote quickly. So Nikki, I'm wondering if we can end the poll now. I think basically everyone on the call has voted, or we give a few seconds more.
Just give it a few more seconds.
Okay.
End that some participants are still trying to vote.
So it's looking quite interesting from the back end here. So it's looking interesting, and I would like, hopefully, would like to hear the views of one or two of us on why we voted the way we did.
So the poll will end in about 10 seconds.
Okay.
So the poll just ended. We'll just share the results from back end.
Okay, so the poll has ended and the verdict is in. So it would appear that we are quite divided on the subject. So 43% of people who are on the poll, who voted, are still, their preference is still to have physical meetings, and 57% have voted in favor of virtual meetings. So it does appear I was thinking that the votes will be tilted towards virtual meetings, but it does appear that quite a number of us company secretaries are still happy to go back to our physical meetings. So to just hear views from one or two participants on who voted as to why. So of course there are very reasons as to why we voted the way we did. Well, it would be nice to hear the views of one or two people as to why, maybe one person in support of virtual meetings and the other in the second in support of physical meetings. We'll then quickly move on to the session proper after we hear the views. So I think that, or if you can drop your comments in the chat box, it will be happy, and I'll just share the views that have been shared. Otherwise, if you can indicate, there's a hand raised. Nike, can you please unmute the person who has their hands raised? I can't see the name from here. If you had raised your hand, I think the name flashed quickly, and I think it was a Chineka. Could you please unmute yourself and to confirm which you are speaking in favor of physical or virtual meetings, and quickly do so. Thank you. So it doesn't appear that she's willing to speak up, but I would like to surmise, maybe speak on behalf of those who have voted in support of virtual meetings. So we have seen from the bit that has happened in the last couple of months that essentially virtual meetings have proved to be less difficult. You know, arranging physical meetings or putting together the preparations leading up to holding meetings typically hasn't really changed much, but the meeting day itself is really what has changed. So for a lot of companies, Bukola or Renuga, I'll call upon you in a second. Just give me a minute to round up on what I was trying to say. So for quite a lot of people who have voted in favor of virtual meetings, I'm thinking that the reason will probably be because of the efficiency. I think probably there's been an improvement, significant improvement in the number of hours that our board meetings would typically take. Cost reduction is another consideration for a lot of people. So costs in terms of if you have directors that are not resident in Lagos, for instance, flying those directors in, accommodation and all of that probably would have dropped significantly. Not probably, definitely would have gone off the table. And then lastly, I think efficiency. But again, on the part of those who have voted against or in support of physical meetings, not against, in support of physical meetings, I think the one major issue will be the technology, the infrastructure we have locally in terms of, you know, the network and all of that. But let me not preempt too much what their views are. So we have two participants who have raised their hands, and I would like to invite the first participant to please go ahead and share her views. Bukola, over to you now.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Bukola. Thank you so much for speaking. Go ahead.
No problem. So I actually voted for in support of virtual meetings.
Okay.
And like you rightly said, aside from the technology involved, because we still sometimes deal with slow internet in the country.
Yeah.
What I feel that we can do as secretaries is for instance, when I have board meetings, I ensure that I have about 3 or 4 internet providers on, apart from the one I am currently on. I have 3 other backups. But why I think I like virtual meetings is you can take all your decisions virtually. You don't have to wait to have a physical meeting. And
Absolutely.
I feel like this is definitely going to be the way forward. And even after Corona, I don't see everybody necessarily. For instance, I work for an association called Bank Directors Association of Nigeria. And even before the coronavirus, I was already suggesting to my council that can we have a situation where those that are not physically able to come into the secretariat can still attend the meetings virtually. So I feel that it's important for us to realize that this is the way forward, and one way or the other, everybody just has to adapt to this new normal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bukola, for sharing. So absolutely, you're correct. So, you know, the efficiency of having those meetings virtually, we cannot begin to quantify. So very quickly, can we hear from someone who disagrees with those who are voting in favor of virtual meetings, please? So I see that two other participants have raised their hand. I hope that one of them will please speak on the issue of why I hope that one of them is speaking on the preference for physical meetings. So Fumi, do you want to go ahead and speak? Hello, Fumi Olatoye. So again, I'm not sure. Fumi, do you want to go ahead? Yes.
Actually, I wasn't sure I raised my hands. That was, I was a bit shocked, but I voted for physical meeting.
Okay.
Because
perfect. So go ahead and tell us why.
I understand the fact that the world around us is changing, and the fact that technology is the hint thing now, and we have to migrate to it. But the quick change was not something most of us were prepared for. So I see this as a preparation that we could have a better way of having our board meetings and any of our meetings and do our jobs while we still try to inculcate in full the virtual technology means of meeting, rather than just assume now that we are ready and we go in for it. We still have technological issues, network issues in Nigeria. We have device issues and all that. So I believe we can grow to full virtual meeting environment, but for now, we migrate gradually. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Fumi. So in essence, what Fumi is saying that she considers this period as a transitionary period, a period that allows us to prepare ourselves to transition, hopefully fully, but maybe not, maybe to 50-50, but eventually transition to virtual meetings in the long term. So in the short term, she thinks that this is an opportunity for us to begin to put in place the infrastructure and the processes that we require to hold our meetings virtually effectively. Thank you very much, Fumi. So moving on to the poll. So it does appear that we are somewhat divided. I mean, the votes were, I think 70%, 17% above. So for virtual meetings, we voted 17% above physical meetings. So it's the distinction, or the camp is not properly, in my view, divided. So we still have some work to do in balancing it out so that we can have a clear position as to whether company secretaries are going to be willing to take this virtual thing, which is now, as we have been saying, our new normal, or not on board or not. So I'd like us now to go into the session proper. And to do that, I need just a second to share my screen with you. And I'm just taking a few minutes to do that. So 1 second while I share my screen. While I do that, I'd like to please request that if we have comments, so as I go through the presentation, if we have comments or additions that we would like to input, that I would like to make to the discussions, could we please drop them in the chat box, and Nike will draw my attention to it as I go along so we can share your views. 1 second. Please, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. So I believe everyone can see the screen and everyone can hear me properly. So, of course, as we said, the thrust of our discussion, or the focus of our discussion today, is meetings and minutes. But with the issue of virtual meetings and all of that, a majority of the time will be spent on discussing how we go about preparing and holding virtual meetings, the things we need to take on board as we do so. And if time permits, as like I said, we'll look at a few critical aspects of meetings and minutes as they are impacted, or have been impacted, or will be impacted by the new normal. The outline of this discussion is as shown on the slide. So key considerations to take on board as we plan for virtual meetings, tips and general best practice standards, and a few pointers on effective minutes writing, what we should pay attention to post the meeting, and then some personal will round off on highlighting the personal attributes of an effective company secretary, particularly given the new climate. So without much further ado, we've spoken to the fact that the pandemic is what has thrust upon us the virtual meeting era. Hopefully soon, when the pandemic is something of the past, we will then be able to clearly determine whether or not this is something that is going to stay with us for the long term. But as like a participant mentioned earlier, I'm of the very strong belief that this is not something that is going to go away, that things are not going to go back to normal exactly the way we had them before the outbreak of the pandemic. But again, we wait and see. And maybe after the pandemic, we'll reconvene a session and have a discussion on how we are doing or how well we have taken on whether the new normal is still the normal or we have gone back to our old ways. So what are the things that we should take into consideration regarding virtual meetings? So in preparing or planning for taking a decision regarding virtual meetings, what's the first thing that we need to do? The first thing we need to do, I would say, is to engage the board. So engage the board and other stakeholders. So regarding engaging the board, you want to make sure that your directors are fully on board. Quite a number of times, for some of the clients that we have, some of the older directors usually would resist holding meetings virtually. So they have issues around not being able to use their own devices properly, or just not wanting to hold the meetings virtually in the first instance. So I think the first step will be to start to engage each director, starting with, of course, with the chairman, with the executive directors, and then other directors, and getting them to come on board with the fact that we want to hold meetings virtually. Then the second step would be to select a suitable platform. So we all know, for instance, we're using Zoom for this webinar. We all know that there are different platforms around the globe that are quite, useful for virtual meetings. So it's to identify. So if your company doesn't have an existing virtual meeting platform that we use internally, you have to then take a decision in conjunction with management, of course, regarding what the most suitable platform would be. We'll speak a little shortly on, some of the decisions or some of the considerations that you should take on board when trying to decide what a suitable platform is. And the next point that one should consider really is whether or not there's any existing regulatory requirements around virtual meetings. Our initial research in this area indicated that there's not any clear regulation up until the outbreak of the pandemic, and of course, our regulators now trying to ensure that regulatory requirements, the standard regulatory requirements, are not going to be, impacted by the outbreak. So a few of the regulators have taken steps to now, make some recommendations around how documents can be submitted electronically and all that. But before now, there was really not much in that area. But regarding meetings, there's really not much up until I think when we'll be speaking to that issue recently, when the CAC issued some guidelines around virtual meetings. And then the other issue to consider is to look at our organizational documents. So internally, our board charters, our terms of reference for the committees, our articles, do they provide for us to hold virtual, do they allow for us to hold virtual meetings? Typically, most companies that were incorporated before 2015 are likely to not have provisions in their articles allowing for meetings to be held virtually. But a few proactive companies incorporated in recent times had incorporated those into their articles, and they are allowed to hold meetings virtually, both especially board meetings, but I'm not very sure that the articles would have provided for AGMs to be held virtually as well. And then the last thing to take on board is to remember to make a mental note of the need, if your articles do not provide, to make a mental note of the need that in the long term, we should take a resolution to the shareholders to allow us to amend the articles to incorporate in the articles a provision that allows us to hold virtual meetings. Most boards who have board charters, I like to believe that most of us company secretaries on the webinar today have developed or put in place board charters and terms of reference. It's useful if we don't have those provisions in the charters to update our charters to allow for virtual meetings. Moving on now, so from a regulatory governance and statutory perspective, so the Nigerian Stock Exchange, in the guidelines that it issued sometime in March this year regarding virtual meetings, stipulated that section 26, by the provisions of section 263 subsection 1 of CAMA, companies, directors are allowed to regulate their meetings as they deem fit. And my understanding of that section is that directors may choose to incorporate the leeway for directors to hold virtual meetings if they choose to do so. And so while there are no clear or specific provisions in the law, CAMA, for instance, regarding virtual meetings, that's us holding virtual meetings can be said to be permissible under section 263 subsection 1. But like I said a few minutes ago, it's important to ensure that our governance charters and our articles provide clearly states so that we prevent any challenge to the validity of meetings held virtually. Of course, meetings that are held virtually during the course of this pandemic are unlikely to be challenged on grounds of being held virtually, but it will be useful that for the long term, our articles and governance charters expressly provide for us to do so. The best practice is to have an expressive permissive provision in the articles, like I just said. And so it will be useful to try to do that if our documents do not already provide. So moving on, what are the other issues that we should take on board in planning and preparing for virtual meetings? So the very first consideration, which the second participant mentioned in explaining why her decision was in favor of physical meetings, was the issue of technology. And that's a major challenge, as we'll all agree, in Nigeria. Technology is indeed, we do have a long way to go. Sometimes people have all kinds of devices, because they know that none is 100% reliable. And we have seen from my experience with all the virtual meetings we have held is that these technologies fail when we least expect them to. So ensuring that and getting relevant stakeholders on board. So an ideal thing to do is to maybe take a decision that for our company, we want to use this network provider or that platform and all of that, and ensure that those facilities are available to all the stakeholders. So the directors and of course, internally the management. And then to decide after that, what the reliable facility in terms of the conferencing will be. So there are very varied options in the market. And like I mentioned earlier, we're using Zoom for this meeting now, for the webinar. There are different other platforms that can be readily accessed online. And I'm sure that a lot of us have used different options not mentioned on this slide, but the more common one has been the Zoom. And I think Microsoft Teams, which I think are safely effective, fairly effective, and easy to navigate. But the very critical, I think the most critical issue to take into consideration when considering what platform to adopt is the security of the platform that you want to use. So what's the level of security? How well can you guarantee that your meetings will not be hacked, if I may use that expression? So you need to take that seriously and ensure that if there are no security features on the platform that you are thinking to use because it's easier to navigate and all that, you in place safeguards for ensuring that only people with access to those meetings can access them. So you need to take precautionary steps just to ensure that all of your meetings are held in a very secure environment. Another thing to do is to always do a trial run of whatever platform you have then taken a decision to use. And then the last thing I like to mention is the need to develop a guidance note. So again, while virtual meetings is not something that is new to us, is something that quite a number of us are very familiar with, our boards are very familiar with, it's useful to develop a document, a policy guide that speaks to the directors and anybody who is going to be participating at that meeting virtually, that this is the way we as a company want to go regarding our virtual meetings. I'll speak a little further down on what this guidance note should essentially speak to. But on the last bit of the tips that we should pay attention to, I mentioned the issue of security. Getting the meetings passworded, each meeting passworded is a semi-secure option to adopt. Another thing is to ensure that you have the right IT support and infrastructure before and during the course of the meeting, so that any network disruptions can easily be addressed and are not, protracted, thereby disrupting the entire meeting. So having the right IT support, having the right IT infrastructure, passwording and ensuring that we have in place security measures are some of the things that we need to do. And again, very importantly, is useful to do a dry run of the first virtual meeting that directors are attending with them before the meeting itself. This can be done either maybe 30 minutes before the actual time or a day before, whatever works best for at the convenience of all of the directors. So it's useful to do the trial run so that directors can check, that their equipment and their networks are, as effective as they ought to be. I see that a number of hands are being raised. I'll request that you please just drop your comments or give me a minute or two to round up on the issue of the guidance note, and then we can take your if there are comments, we should be able to take them one or two immediately. But if there are questions, I would like to request that you please drop them in the Q&A section, and we'll take them once the time for the session itself is up. So very quickly, speaking to what our guidance note should be about, should cover. So of course, like any standard document, it should have an introductory aspect. We should state what the purpose of the document is and the applicability. So does the document relate to both director meetings, shareholder meetings? Does it incorporate management meetings and all of that? So you need to define what kinds of meetings that document will be applicable to. Then the other are the statutory and governance considerations. So like I mentioned earlier at the beginning, if your governance documents or articles allow for virtual meetings, then that policy document should reference those provisions clearly and, for support. And then the next thing is that the document should contain explanatory notes, very brief explanatory, simple but brief explanatory notes regarding the key features of the platform that the company has decided to go with and what the key elements of that platform are and how they can be navigated, so that it's clear to any user of that document that this is the platform that the company has adopted. If there are two or more than one, then it should incorporate the two options that are available and also state the key elements of each of the platforms, so that anybody looking at it can easily understand how to navigate that document even by themselves. And the second but last thing to do is for that document to set clearly what the ground rules at meetings are. So for board meetings, let's focus now on board meetings. For board meetings, of course, there should be ground rules. It's not holding virtual meetings is, in my opinion, is a totally different kettle of fish from a physical meeting. So we know the nuances of physical meetings, opening prayer for some companies, welcome remarks for some, a tea break, those kinds of things, interruptions, break for lunch. With virtual meetings, those things are no longer really going to be part or critical aspects of the meeting. So it's important to define what the ground rules are. And some of the issues that that aspect of the document will address will be, for instance, something as simple as renaming devices. So I've been at meetings, for instance, when I just see Techno 351, and I'm wondering, so which director is that? I just see iPhone 7 or iPhone 11, and I'm wondering whose iPhone is that? So it's useful for the document to advise directors of the need, or whoever is using the document, of the need to properly rename their devices so that they can be easily identified during the course of the meeting. And then to also mention whether it's an audio meeting or we're going to be going all video, when to mute, when not to mute, and all of that. So those are some of the things that should be covered in the ground rules. The last thing I would like to mention is the need for the document to also speak to the general order of proceedings at each meeting. So things around confirming that everyone is up on the call, like a roll call by the chair, and who should do the roll call. If it's the company secretary that should do a roll call just before the meeting takes off, after we have confirmed that we have a quorum, we want to, I think that, for instance, the discussion around whether or not there's a quorum should go hand in hand with the roll call, because it's the roll call that lets us know that we have formed a quorum. And then the order of the meeting, essentially. So when I mean order of the meeting, so taking turns in speaking. So for instance, the document should state very briefly how directors should speak to documents. So do we want to go the route of the chairman being the one to identify directors by name and invite them to speak on each matter that is being deliberated upon? So I give a simple example, the agenda for a meeting. Do we want to say that the chairman will then call each director by name, or do we want to simply state that directors should please indicate if they have objections to any issue or comments by seeking the chairman's audience to speak? So those kinds of things are the things that should be covered in that aspect of the document. And then lastly, of course, it should advise anybody participating on the meeting virtually as to how they should exit the meeting. You'll be surprised. Some people will not know how to exit a virtual meeting. So having said that, I'd like to confirm if we have any comments that pertain to what we have spoken to. Nikki, are you able to advise if we have any comments that pertain to this aspect of the discussion, so we can quickly share those comments before we proceed? Nikki?
Yes, and we just have some contributions.
Okay. Do you want to share the contributions for the full house?
Okay, so Ezine Ayoko, I'm sorry if I just murdered your name. I apologize. Says, in relation to annual general meeting, we know the importance of this meeting in terms of election and voting. Physical meetings serves better.
Okay, I recall. Okay, thank you, Nikki. I recall that Ezine had raised her hand at some point, but then didn't speak when I invited her to. So we will address that comment. We'll take that comment on board when we come to the issue of AGMs, which is very shortly from now. So I'd like to go on, if we please. So again, virtual meetings. I think this is the most topical issue for most of us, the issue of virtual AGMs. We know that earlier in the year, precisely on the 26th of March, the CAC issued guidelines. I'm so sorry. The CAC issued guidelines regarding holding AGMs by proxy in line with Section 230 of the Companies and Allied Matters Act. But we also know that those guidelines relate only to public companies. So we'd like to speak quickly on some of the details of those guidelines, and then address comments, if any, take on comments, if any, on the issue. So like I mentioned, the guidelines that the CAC issued applies principally to public companies, and we all will agree why that is the case. Public companies are the ones who have quite a large number of shareholders, and with the outbreak of the pandemic and restrictions around movement and all of that, social distancing and all the guidelines and rules regarding staying safe that were issued, there had to have been some measures to ensure that companies could still hold AGMs and meet regulatory requirements, and all of that. For quite a number of companies, dates for AGMs were set before the outbreak of the pandemic, and so the guidelines by CAC was indeed very timely. A few listed companies canceled, but I'm happy to report, and I'm sure we'll agree that we have had a ton of virtual AGMs in the last couple of months, I believe since around April. So what's the procedure that the guideline has advised? So the CSC insists that there should be a formal request to it for approval. So a public company cannot on its own take a decision that, okay, we want to hold our AGM by proxy as issued based on the guidelines that CSC has issued. The company must necessarily, so the company secretary, we company secretaries have a duty to formally request approval from the CSC for our meetings to be held virtually. That request for approval is typically required to be accompanied by the draft notice of meeting. And the reason why that is the case is because the guidelines stipulate that only certain items can be considered at such a meeting. So as you would see on the slide, there's a designated email address, the rg@csc.gov.ng, to which such requests for approvals must be sent. And if you have access to the email address of the director in charge of such matters, it's ideal to keep that director copied. After the approval has been obtained, and I must commend the CSC, for those of you who have had the experience, you would agree that they have been quite prompt with their feedback. So the requests are typically responded to by the next working day. So the longest it will happen it will take would be that you sent your request on a Friday. The earliest you will expect to receive a response is on Monday. So on that note, I would say that the CSC has done very well in their responsiveness to requests received from companies. The other issue we should mention is the fact that after the CSC has granted approval, you then submit that approval from the CSC to the stock exchange along with your draft notice again for its approval. And then of course, the typical process of, processes that we would adopt in getting approvals and publications and all of that ahead of the AGM. The guidelines also allowed for the circulation of annual reports to members electronically. And this is something that working with the registrars, you will help to organize and ensure that the annual reports are circulated timely. Again, the guidelines insisted that companies must comply with the 21-day period, circulation period. That's the notice period. And then, of course, the guidelines allowed for companies to stream the AGMs live and on the website. So I'd like to just quickly speak on the issue of the proxy. So we'll have a short conversation on that very briefly. But, for a lot of companies, there was not much clarity as to who should be this proxy. So what the guidelines said was that mandatorily, the proxies that the company is nominating for members to pick from must be stated on the notice of the meeting. And so what we saw that a lot of public companies did was to have some of the directors on the directors as proxies. Different companies went different ways, but that was the common route that we saw that they took. The CSC also indicated that they will then send a representative to the meeting physically. What our experience, however, has shown that because of travel restrictions, not many CSC representatives were at quite a number of the AGMs that have taken place over the past couple of weeks. But again, typically, you would be required to send them an invitation anyway. So as you send your the stock exchange, the SEC and the FRC invitations to attend the AGM, you would as well typically invite the CSC. We must commend the NSC and SEC particularly, because I think that for quite a number of the AGMs, the stock exchange was very properly represented. In a few of the meetings, they were physically present, of course, if the companies had in place all the social distancing requirements, and then for some, they joined the meeting remotely. And we think that those efforts have been very productive and have helped companies hold very efficient meetings. So moving on to the major restrictions that the circular, the guidelines stipulated. So there were some restrictions that quite a number of companies struggled with. So the major restriction, which was in the very first circular that they circulated, was the fact that such AGMs could only discuss ordinary business, which means only those items that are listed in section 214 of CAMA. I think that subsequent to that circular, there was some pushback and a few companies registered some concern. And a few weeks after that, the CAC then issued a circular saying that companies could discuss also special business subject to providing justification for the urgency and necessity of that special business on the notice of the meeting. So that allowed companies the leeway to at least include some special businesses on their agenda. And I see that from a few AGMs that I have, notices that I have looked at, that a few companies took advantage of this leeway. And then the other issue that was for me a major restriction was the fact that members could only choose the proxies that were listed on the notice of the AGM. And we know that that is somewhat kind of, not exactly, we'll discuss that briefly, but not on all fours with what section 230 of CAMA says. And then the last restriction was regarding the fact that companies must strictly comply with published guidelines regarding social distancing and all of that. And quite a number of the AGMs that I have participated on had the privilege of watching online. I would say almost all the companies did perfectly with compliance. Moving on now. So the CAC circular also requires that after the AGM, and this is something that I think that they may not be able to monitor effectively, and that some of us as company secretaries will fail to do, would like to encourage us all who are company secretaries to listed companies to ensure that we do. We are required to submit a report to CAC, which I think should be a one-pager, saying that the deliberations were conducted, just a brief summary of the deliberations at the meeting, how the deliberations were conducted, and then proof that we complied with the published guidelines regarding social distancing and all of that. I'm not sure what kind of proof that the CAC is expecting, but maybe pictures, I'm not sure, snapshots or videos or clips of the AGM itself will be useful in that area. And given that the reports are being submitted electronically anyway, it to be easy to provide that kind of evidence for to the CAC. So just a note to draw attention to the fact that that circular has a requirement for us to submit reports to the CAC after the AGM. And like I said, those reports should typically be a one-pager, just confirming that the deliberations were properly conducted, so my apologies, and that we complied with the regulation requirements around social distancing. And so I would like now to ask a question, which I alluded to a few minutes ago, as to whether we think that the guidelines regarding members appointing proxies to vote on their behalf at the meetings raise any potential legal implications. I don't know if we have one or two people that would like to share their views on this. So I'd like to explain what the poser is here. So the guidelines, like we mentioned earlier, say that members should appoint proxies. Proxies now, not of their choice, but of the company's choice. So the members are restricted to choose only from the list that the companies have stated, the list of proxies that are contained on the notice of meeting. Do we think, as company secretaries and as lawyers, do we think that this guidelines or this provision raises any legal implications? I'm very excited to hear one or two views on this issue. If you'd like to speak, kindly just unmute yourself and let's hear your views. Any takers in the house, please? Yeah, I see that 2 participants have raised their hands. Please unmute yourself and go ahead. If you are willing to speak, could you please go ahead? The floor is yours.
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Yeah,
good evening, rather.
Evening, yeah. My name is Moses Somorogbe. I'm the company secretary of Linkage Assurance PLC.
Okay, good evening, Moses. Go ahead.
Yeah, my take on this, the issue of proxy, even though I'm in the process of also holding the company AGM through using proxies, but my view is that firstly is the evaluation of the rights of the shareholder.
Okay.
Because CAMA clearly provides that the shareholders have a right to attend a meeting either by themselves or a proxy. That is to say that is a right that is conferred to them by law. That so for CSCs to now restrict them to certain persons, I believe that is clearly a violation of that right that has been conferred to them by law. That is their choice to either attend meetings or appoint a proxy, but to now restrict them. Okay, let's say on business grounds is fine, but if it's challenged in court, I believe that the court might not toe the line of CAC.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Moses. Thank you for sharing. Does anybody in the house have a different view? Is anybody of a different view? I'd like to hear if someone has an opposing view to what Moses has said.
Yeah.
If you have a different view, please go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, go ahead, please. Is that Fumi speaking?
It's Fumi. Yes, it's Fumi Olatoye again. I'm not upholding the same view as Mr. Moses had earlier on. You know, when this pandemic earlier started, I had to do a research on the reaction of shareholders, as in majorly minority shareholders, on this issue of the CAC guidelines, and most of them were not happy about it. Most of the people I interviewed in the course of the research, some of us were already considering and preparing for numerous litigation as far as any of the companies they are shareholders told the line of CAC. So it's kind of a door opening for litigation and dispute and the rest after this whole pandemic thing.
Okay, thank you very much Fumi, for sharing. So I'm very anxious to hear if somebody has a different view. So if you please have a different view, meaning that if you support, or if you are of the view that circular and this issue of the proxies being proposed by the company doesn't really raise any legal implications, I would be very happy to hear from you.
Hello.
Please go ahead. If you could kindly introduce yourself.
My name is Amaka. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Amaka.
Sorry, what I want to speak about is not. First of all, I agree that the issue of restricting shareholders to proxies selected by the company will be a case for litigation after the AGM. I agree totally. But I was also going to share my experience. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Amaka. Go ahead.
Yes, you said that that the proxies need to be listed on the notice of AGM.
Yes.
We didn't do that, and we were granted approval.
Okay. How did you communicate your proxies to the shareholders? Was this in your annual report?
No, we said that we're going to list it on the company's website.
Okay.
And also on the proxy forms.
Okay.
So, and that was approved by CAC.
CAC, yes. So the CAC didn't restrict as to how you should go about notifying shareholders of the list of proxies, but they proposed that an ideal method would be to list that on the. So I attended a session that the MBA organized in conjunction with the CAC on the matter. And one of the proposals was, of course, listing it on the notice. And like you mentioned, the quite a number of people were in support of it being listed on the company's website. But again, not all shareholders would have had access to quickly check that on the website before filling in their proxy forms. But thank you very much for sharing. So it does appear that there's no one on this platform today that has a different view, where we kind of are in support of the view that the leeway that CAC has granted for companies to appoint proxies on behalf of shareholders or to propose a list that shareholders can choose from is restrictive, and it's a potential ground for litigation. The jury is still out there, and we do hope, we hope that we will not have any issues or litigation arising from this issue in the nearest future. But like I said, the jury is still out. We wait and see how things evolve. So moving on, so I do apologize. It seems as if my laptop has gone to sleep. I need a few seconds to, so I'll just take a second or two to stop my share and reshare the slides. So again, these are some of the technological glitches that we can have when we are having virtual meetings, in support of those of us that are on for physical meetings. So the rest of the slides really focus on some of the key things that we should take into account. So I'm going to only be highlighting regarding meetings generally, but I will take the opportunity to highlight some of the critical or tiny little aspects that we may take for granted when we are holding meetings virtually. And so I'll quickly go to that. So before the meeting, one of the things, and this is something that we already do anyways for meetings generally, but one of the things that we should take into account of all the time, particularly with virtual meetings, is the different time zones. So if you have a board that has non-resident directors, you should always take into account time zones in scheduling meetings, differences in time zones, depending on which part of the globe that the directors are to do that. The other thing is recording. So we know that typically if we hold physical meetings, we do not record. So when I say record, I'm talking about using a recording device to record our meetings. It is highly unlikely that company secretaries will seek, will record meetings standardly. But for virtual meetings, because of the issues that we have all kind of agreed that we tend to experience with connectivity and network and all of that, it's safe to always request, and you start doing that by engaging the chairman, to always request some approval to record the meeting, so that should, in case you, the company secretary, is the one who then suffers a technical glitch or network connectivity issue and you fall off the meeting, you don't lose any part of the conversation. And so you're able to, when you are preparing your minutes, quickly go through and ensure that you haven't lost any part of the conversation. The other thing to also draw your attention to when you're holding meetings virtually, typically when we go for meetings, we always have our camera, we have our mat ready, we have all of our physical documents ready. In virtual meetings, of course, you should still have all of those documents ready. And the important thing to do is always have them readily saved somewhere on your desktop. So should you be called upon to, advise the board or seek, provide clarification on anything, you are not going through searching in your documents. You have already prepared by saving those documents on desktop, so you can easily open them up and then check what you need to revert to the board on. The other thing that we will typically do at meetings, of course, as we all know, is to capture attendance at those meetings. And for most of us, we either we print out a sheet of paper and have our directors fill it, or we have a register, a physical, a hard copy notebook that we call a register of attendance that directors are required to sign at the meeting. So I'd like us to, if we are able to share our views on what we have done. So if anybody is willing to share their view. So for the and I'm asking to those of us who have held virtual meetings, how have we captured the attendance at those meetings? Is anybody able or willing to share what they have done? So again, I see that we have participants raising their hands too. If you're raising your hand, could you please just unmute yourself and share with us how you have captured attendance at the virtual meetings you have had? So Nike, unfortunately, I can't see from my end the participants who are raising their hands. I don't know if you can see them at your end, and if you could kindly just call out their names so that they can speak up. Nike, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so Talatu indicated by raising her hand, so she has been unmuted. She has the floor to speak.
Okay, please go ahead then.
I'm a secretary for a government office.
Okay.
So what we do with attendance is sometimes we take a snapshot, like a screenshot of the participant.
Okay.
Yes. That's
okay.
what we do.
Okay, thank you very much.
It in our attendance register.
Okay, thank you very much, Talatu, for sharing that. Really appreciate it. So essentially what Talatu has said is how we should start that process. So a screenshot of the attendance at the meeting. So you know that usually at the left side of the screen of a virtual meeting, depending on which platform, of course, you're using. Different platforms, of course, will have some differences in how the people who are on the meeting are represented. But the standard is to have the list of the people, their names, so based on how they join, which is why the point we raised earlier on the need to rename, to properly rename themselves is very crucial. So it's important to encourage directors or other people, stakeholders at any meeting to properly rename themselves so that you can then capture that screenshot and record it as attendance. But in addition to what Talatu says, as opposed to then pasting that screenshot, which is useful, pasting the screenshot, if you can put it in the format that goes with your attendance register, it will also be useful to then type out the names and the designations of the people who were at that meeting, and then have the chairman sign off whenever you can. And you can send it to the chairman electronically to sign off at the bottom of that in confirmation that these were the people that were in attendance at that meeting, and then you paste. So you either do as Talatu has said, or you go this route. So it's either a screenshot, but I think it's very useful to get the chairman to revalidate the attendance of directors at that meeting by just typing it out printing it out, getting him or signing it off electronically, and then printing it and pasting it in your attendance register if you have like a book that you use for attendance register. Thank you very much, Talatu, for sharing. So moving on, I'd like us to speak quickly to another interesting issue that regarding meetings that virtual meetings has imposed on us. And that issue is the issue of whether electronic signatures are now valid. So we know that the chairman's signature on the minutes of the meeting is prima facie evidence that the meeting was properly convened and conducted, and is proof that, and typically standard practice is to have those minutes signed jointly by the chairman and the company secretary, who is the author of those minutes. We have experience has shown that some company secretaries have the practice of only the chairman signing of the minutes. I'd like to encourage those company secretaries to please try and see if they can adopt the standard practice, which is that they sign jointly with the chairman as authors of the minutes. And so the poser, and I'd like us to share our views on this, is whether or not we consider that electronic signatures are now valid. Electronic signatures on minutes can be considered valid. For most of the meetings that are going to be held virtually, it will not be easy. So of course, there are ways around getting the minutes signed off by the chairman. You print them out after the virtual meeting. If you need to update, you update, and then you print them out and arrange for the minutes to be dispatched by someone who, you know, of course, will go to the chairman's house or office and get them signed and returned to you. But quite a number of us have adopted the practice of just getting the minutes electronically signed and sent back to us. Do we think that these signature electronically signed minutes are valid? In the contemplation of Kama and what it says about the execution of minutes by the chairman being evidence of the validity of the minutes of the meeting. I'd like to hear your views, please. And like we have done, if you'd like to share your views, please just unmute yourself and go ahead. Any takers in the house, please? So I see participants raising their hands. Nika, if you can see their names, can you please invite them by name to speak?
Good evening.
Good evening, Bukola.
Good evening. So basically, I don't think that an electronically signed minute would work. Okay. What I think, for instance, with us, I usually would just send the documents to the chairman's house.
Okay.
And if it's not possible, is it not better to just wait until for if after the pandemic and when the person is able to sign physically, as against appending an electronic signature to the document, because that doesn't make the document valid from my own understanding.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bukola, for sharing. And I'm hoping that someone who has will be happy to get some additional comments or views on the issue. But speaking to Bukola's view, so Bukola, I think that the major concern, and this is why we have raised this issue, the major concern is that there's no end in sight yet as to when the pandemic will end and when restrictions regarding travel will be lifted. So for instance, I give a simple example. For instance, if I have a chairman who is resident in Abuja, and how am I going to, okay, so DHL or something, and then he signs and couriers it back to me. So that's probably the most practical way to go. But the other issue that has made us raise this issue at this point is the fact that, for instance, we know that the CAC is looking to start accepting electronically signed documents. So we've had some discussions. We know that they are in discussions with the MBA regarding, you know, the validity of CAC documents that have electronic signature on them. We've had complaints on one of the sessions I attended, organized by the MBA. We've had some concerns around how you are incorporating a company and all the directors or majority of the directors are in different parts of the world. And at this point, with what is happening, it's impossible to get documents physically signed and returned and, you know, couriered back to Nigeria. So again, the conversation is around that, and we thought to raise that as regards minutes. So I agree with you, Bukola. I'm of the view that, you know, we should try to find compliant ways. When I say compliant, in compliance with current restrictions, to get the minutes signed and pasted in the minute book. But I don't think it is out of place to get the minutes electronically signed in advance. So my suggestion would be, after the meetings, get the minutes electronically signed in advance. So if, particularly given the uncertainty around how long this will go on. So if you are going to have another, let's say 3 or 4 meetings, hopefully it won't take that long. But let's say you're going to have 3 or 4 meetings for the rest of the year, and you don't have your minutes signed. Before the time, after the time is over, to take a bit of time to put everything together and send it out, get it signed and pasted. So in advance of that, having to do that, I don't think it will be out of place to just get the documents, the minutes signed, and you have that in your records, just in case someone requests. So for some of our clients, and for quite a number of companies, for instance, they will not release unsigned minutes to auditors for an audit engagement. So during the audit exercise, of course, we know that the auditors will send a list of documents that they require from the company secretary. And one of the critical documents that they always request for is minutes of meetings that took place during the period in respect of which the audit relates. So for instance, your financial year end is March, and your 2019/2020 financial year ended sometime in March 31st this year. And so that's the last meeting that you held for the period that the auditors are about to commence the audit for, and you haven't been able to get the chairman to sign the minutes. I think it would be proactive to get an electronic copy. Most of the audits, and I'm sure we know that most of the audits that are ongoing right now are being done remotely and virtually. So I think it would be useful to begin to get our documents signed electronically in advance of still having the physical copies signed and for the records. I don't know if anybody has another view, a different view, or some additional comments to make on the matter.
Yes, madam.
Okay, Mr. Moses, please go ahead. Mr. Moses, go ahead. Yes.
I have a contrary view. My view is that electronic signature currently is as good as physical signing, because if we look at the Evidence Act, we look at section 93 sub 2 of the Evidence Act. Okay. It clearly provides that where a rule of evidence requires a signature or provides for certain consequences if a document is not signed, an electronic signature satisfies the rule of law. So an electronic signature, as far as Kama said, if it's signed by the chairman, that it makes it valid, the prima facie evidence. It means that if it's electronically signed, it's as good as a document the minute being signed. That's what that provision is saying. So I believe, my take is that whether electronically or physically signed, in this era, the chairman can even be any country in the world.
On the world, absolutely.
Company, that doesn't mean that the company business will not
go on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so very much, Mr. Moses, for bringing that valuable insight into the issue. So again, I think that this is a matter that I don't know how it will be interpreted in court. And so I'm not going to form an opinion on it, but I think that is something, because the CAC itself has failed to accept, even as we speak, electronic signatures. I don't know if anybody has been successful with getting them to accept an annual return form, for instance, that was electronically signed because the chairman is sitting somewhere in Singapore. If you do, please be kind to share your success so that we can take that on board and argue our case as we engage them. But I know for a fact that the few documents that we have submitted electronically, I dare say that we submitted an annual return a couple of weeks ago, and the financial statements that was attached to the annual returns was an electronic financial statement. So it was something that we printed in colored and submitted, and they declined, and we had to engage to get a physical, an originally signed document. So again, that's a discussion that we need to have with CAC, and we know that while CAMA is law as it is, the CAC is the body that we have to hold ourselves to account regarding these matters. So thank you very much, Moses, and I think that that's an argument that we can hold. I think we can put forward anywhere, but whether or not the people with whom we engage will agree with us is another matter. Hopefully we will have, I'm not sure that we have any case law on minutes on electronic signatures yet. I will do further research and find out if we do. Thank you very much. So now we have two differing views, both views perfectly valid. And I don't know if anybody has a different perspective to share on the matter. I think that Ms. Clementina raised her hand. Clementina, do you want to say something? I guess not. So moving on. Again, I think my laptop is playing some tricks on me. Okay. So moving on, let's speak very quickly. So we all, as company secretaries, take it for granted that because we have been doing this for donkey years, we have gotten perfect at it. We know that we should always continue to work to improve. And so the stuff on this slide is something that I'm sure all of us are totally conversant with, and something that we implement. Again, Clementina is raising her hand again. Clementina, do you want to say something? Please unmute yourself and go ahead. You are currently muted.
She says she has an opinion on the execution of minutes. I will just try and
unmute her. Yes, I'm trying to. She's still muted. Clementina, please unmute yourself and share your views.
Thank you very much for unmuting me. I've been in the corner screaming to be heard.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Please go ahead.
My name is Clementina Ramsey Osere. On the electronic execution of minutes, I want to align my opinion to Moses' opinion. Okay. However, I want to also add that drawing from section to the section that we started, that directors are allowed to 263. Yes, that directors are allowed to regulate their affairs as they deem fit. I think that as a company secretary, if we can also record, in addition to the Evidence Act allowance, I think if we can also record in the minutes that this minute, the board approves that this minute should be signed electronically. I think that flies. If we can get the board approval and record in the minutes that this minute may be signed electronically, I think that suffices and it can go anywhere.
Okay.
That's my opinion. And it can be pasted. It's good to be pasted on the minutes book.
Oh, okay. So that's a very, very, very useful contribution. Thank you very much for Clementina for sharing your views. So we have three ideas on the table. One is to be proactive and get the minutes signed electronically anyways. And for those of us that are of the view that we have to comply strictly with the provisions of CAMA on getting the chairman to sign physically, and the lack of clarity on whether or not an electronic signature of minutes is valid or not, we can then subsequently take the action of getting the minutes signed and pasted. And then in support of Moses, in addition to that, in support of this position is Moses's view that based on the provisions of the Evidence Act, I think 93, he said, we can, it is permissible under law. And then lastly, Clementina has added to that and said that we can also additionally get the board to expressly approve that this particular minute will be executed electronically and will be deemed to be valid. Thank you very much. So I think we have a clear path on this issue. Thank you all for sharing. So as I was saying, so quite a lot of us are already familiar with a lot of these things, but I think it's useful to mention one or two things that we should mention, we should pay attention to in terms of the quality of the minutes that we prepare. And one of these is, I think, clarity, objectivity, and accuracy. I would like to also add to that completeness. So given the fact that quite a number of the meetings are now virtual, it's important that we, like we said, not lose out on conversations and that we are able to capture the minutes properly. We don't want to say, we don't want to have to hear our directors or anybody who has to use the minutes for any reason, maybe for audit or whatever, to say that the minutes were not clear enough. Is it because the meeting was held virtually, or that the minutes were not reported accurately enough? We don't want to allow our directors to have those kinds of, express those kind of complaints. So I think that we need to do a bit more in terms of our efforts in ensuring that our minutes are clear and accurate and very complete. Also, again, an issue which we will take for granted again, but there's not much we can do in terms of our listening abilities if we already have those good listening skills. I think what we want to do to ensure that those skills are not compromised in any way as it regards virtual meetings is to ensure that as the company secretary, your facilities at your end, so if you are joining the meeting virtually as well, that you have the right network and the right connectivity. Of course, you can't guarantee 100%, but you should go out of your way to ensure that you have the best possible for each meeting. And then lastly, financial literacy. This is something that quite a lot of us company secretaries struggle with, and particularly as it relates to reporting of financial statements. I think that as company secretaries, we should make the effort, and this doesn't relate to virtual meetings, it relates to all kinds of meetings. We need to educate ourselves financially so that we can understand deliberations pertaining to financial documents and figures when these are being considered at the board meeting. So I'd like to close the session, the discussion by quickly just speaking to some of the hallmarks of, I am sure 99.9% of us already have these attributes anyway, but I thought to remind us of what makes us the distinguished company secretaries that we are. And so, of course, we all have good, strong interpersonal and communication skills. It takes courage and confidence to be a company secretary. I'm sure we all agree with that, based on all of our personal experiences on the job. Of course, we cannot overemphasize, this is a given. Integrity is something that we all must have at the highest level of it. Independent thinking, of course, this is also a given. We have to be open-minded. So again, speaking to the open-mindedness of us as company secretaries, that this new normal is potentially going to be the normal for the long term. We have to be open-minded about that. And as one of the participants said at the beginning, begin to see this only as a transition period and put in place all the structures and processes that we need for the immediate future. And then accountability and responsibility. This again is for, we cannot overemphasize and we mustn't take for granted. As company secretaries, we continue to be accountable to our boards, and we must all ensure that we are responsible at all times, particularly given these trying and difficult times. And second but last, emotional intelligence. It's difficult to manage directors, different kinds of directors, board dynamics and all of that, relationships that directors, both with management and executive and non-executive. We need to be emotionally intelligent and equipped to handle the dynamics that we will encounter as we do our work. And then lastly, I dare say we all are enthusiastic about the work that we do. Sometimes it can be challenging. For me, I think that the virtual meetings has been a bit of a respite. So the number of hours I sit in going to work, coming back or heading to a meeting has been taken off. So for me, that has helped ginger my enthusiasm. So energy and enthusiasm, given the tediousness that sometimes can be associated with the work, is something that we all must strive to have. Having said that, I'd like to close by telling us that the issue of the virtual meetings, like we have all agreed, not all 100%, but we all kind of agreed, is now the new normal. And we need to, as company secretaries in the 21st century, take this on board and be happy to run with it for either for the short term or the long term. Thank you very much for listening. If there are any questions, I see that there are no questions yet in the, okay, there are 2 questions in the Q&A. And Laide Adeyemo says that she doesn't think that there's any problem with electronic signature. I think we've kind of pretty much agreed on that. And she also adds that she's of the opinion that the same doctrine of necessity for a virtual meeting is also what works for electronic signatures. Thank you very much, Laide, for your contribution. I'm happy to take any questions at this point, if there are any.
Very much, and that was a very insightful presentation. We really thank you and appreciate you for sharing those insights with us. So I have a question from the chat box from Abiola Monsuru. She's concerned about private limited liability companies in having a virtual AGM. Focus is on PLC. What level of compliance is required from the limited companies, especially those operating in an in a regulated industry?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And I'd like to just quickly address it. So what we have experienced is that for limited companies, of course, they can also hold virtual meetings, virtual AGMs. So, but because there are the guidelines for the circular from CAC did not address private companies, there's been some confusion around whether or not they can also hold virtual AGMs. Our view is that they can, but you need to take certain steps. So where your articles do not expressly state, as we have spoken to regarding public companies, we need to necessarily, and this is very easy to do because for private companies, the number of shareholders is limited. So it's easy to get a shareholder resolution signed and approved. So in advance, just to ensure that we have covered all bases, it's advisable to get a shareholders resolution approving that the AGM should be held virtually. And then to also then, after that, get the approval for the amendments to be, the articles to be amended to allow for virtual meetings going forward, virtual AGMs going forward. So yes, the response is that, why not? If public companies can hold virtual meetings, why can't private companies do so? But for private companies, because the circular did not clearly address us, we should take this proactive step of getting approval from the shareholders for us to hold the meeting virtually, and then take steps to amend articles to expressly provide that we can do so going forward. I don't know if I've sufficiently addressed the question. I hope I have.
I'm sure you have, and thank you very much. Chigbo Onyekachuku, you've indicated that you would like to say something. You have the floor now. Just a minute to ask your question or make your contribution. Hello, Chigbo, can you hear us?
Chigbo, the floor is yours, but you are still muted. So if you quickly unmute yourself, you have the floor.
Okay, so that we don't waste time, we'll go to Mr. Moses Omorigwe. You have the floor, Moses.
I didn't raise my hand, or maybe it's the earlier one that I did.
Okay, technical. Yeah. Thank you. So Chigbo, I don't know if you can hear us, but I can see that you are still muted. If you want to unmute yourself, and please just go ahead. Nike, it doesn't appear that she can. Yes, it doesn't appear that she can hear us. So if you want to go ahead, if we have other questions or anyone else has indicated that you're... Go ahead, Nike. Go ahead, Nike.
Can everyone hear me?
You broke off for a while, but I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Okay, so Ms. Adeyemi did indicate that she would raise her hand. So you have the floor, ma'am.
It was an error, my apologies.
All right, ma'am.
That's fine, ma'am. So, and thank you very much. In the absence of any other contribution from participants, we thought to just would appreciate some feedback from you on participants from this session. So we'll just deploy a poll right away, and would appreciate if participants can just spare just a few seconds and complete the poll. So it's going up right about now. So it's up already. We just appreciate your feedback. We do this often, and one of the things we do at DCSL is to continuously engage our participants for feedback in order to improve for future trainings and webinars. So we'd appreciate that everybody just participate, please. Thank you very much. The responses are coming in. Thank you very much. So we'll just give 10 more seconds and then close the poll. And that's a wrap. So the poll has come to an end. So we'll take a few minutes to share the
Hello.
One with the which is a collaboration with our partner of July. It's actually on the role of the company secretary in board evaluation performance. We know that company secretaries typically provide some support to consultants, sure how and what contributions are expected from them. So this training would actually provide some insights into what is expected of us as company secretaries. We also have the Corporate Governance Masterclass, which is a collaboration with the Institute of Chartered Company Secretaries of Nigeria. We also have a few trainings coming up for directors. Within the months, we have the Strategic Leadership, the Financial Stewardship, and the Audit Committee Masterclass. So we had an Audit Committee Masterclass 2 days ago, and we got the feedback that because of companies were having their AGMs, some audit committee members who would love to be in attendance couldn't make it. So we urge company secretaries here in attendance. So please nominate their directors and audit committee members for these trainings. We also thought to introduce an e-board to us. So following the presentation and following the current pandemic, we know that can everyone hear me?
Nika, so just to draw your attention to the fact that you are breaking off really badly and that we just, okay, your screen has now come up. So go ahead. We hope that the connectivity will be better
I
now.
apologize about that. That's one of the issues we're talking about, the fact that technology is not reliable. I apologize. So we thought to also introduce the e-board. The e-board is something that is very important right now, given the fact that all of these meetings are being held virtually. So we would send the link we'll send a link to participants to brief you on the e-board, and then you can request for a demo once you see that it's something that you are interested in or you would like to know more about. We thought to also say thank you for everybody being here. Just to also note that the presentation slides for this event will only be available on request. So if you would want a copy, please send an email to me at ntaiwo@dcsl.com.ng. We look forward to welcoming you at future DCSL events, and we hope you make our time to join us and also nominate your directors and other managements to join us. We sign up now. Thank you very much.
Thank you much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and please continue to stay safe. Bye for now.